Hi everyone, my name is Eduardo. I'm a Vue.js core team member, and I also work as a freelance in frontend. And you can find me around as Posva. And I have been contributing for the Vue ecosystem for quite a few years now. And my focus lately has been the router. So I've been maintaining the router for Vue 2 for a few years now. And I have rewritten the Vue Router for Vue 3. And it comes with a lot of improvements that I want to talk to you about today and give you some practical guidelines that you can use for your migration or your new applications on Vue 3. So the router is that piece of software that is in between the URL, also uses JavaScript history API and connects it to your Vue application. On the side, inside you also have things like the matcher, and you have components like router link and router view, and they are all connected to your Vue applications. And today, I don't really want to talk about the inside of the router because I've done that in the talk, but I will cover a few things that will help you understand better how the router works and overall give you a better approach on how to keep and build more maintainable applications with Vue Router 4. So I'm going to show you sometimes some examples of code, and sometimes the code is for the old version of Vue Router. The old version of Vue Router, which is the version 3, is for Vue 2. And you're going to see that yellow label on the top that's going to indicate that. So right now, if you want to create a Vue application with Vue 2, Vue Router exposes a default router class that you have to instantiate, and you have this mode option that needs a string, and you have an array of routes, and then you call Vue use with the router, the default export from Vue Router, and then pass the instance of the router to new Vue. In Vue 4, we have a few things. We no longer have one default export in Vue Router package. We only have named exports. So we have to import a function called create router, a function called create web history, and we call create router to create that router instance, and we directly pass that to the app. So we call app.use. App is the result of create app in Vue 3, by the way. So we directly call that, and we have a router up and running. Then we also have the routes history, the routes array. It's pretty much the same. There are a few advantages over the previous method. One of them is that this approach is tree shakeable. If you don't use the web hash history, if you don't use the abstract history, we don't need to include that code in your final bundle. So the final size of Vue Router is smaller. It also allows custom history implementations, so you can create, extend, or create your own history implementations with some more specific use case, like keeping track of every single entry that the user visits and stuff like that. Now, when it comes to the routes array, it hasn't changed that much. So these array routes works both in Vue Router 3 and Vue Router 4. Now, the main change about the routes is that we no longer use path to regex. Now, there are multiple benefits of this approach, but the main thing and the main benefit of not using path to regex anymore is that we have a lower level control of how the routes are generated, how the regular expression for the route are generated. So we can order them in a way that makes dynamic routing work. We still have the options like strict and sensitive, and you will see that most of the syntax is still the same, and even the things that do not exist anymore, they can still be created through custom regex in parameters. So you should be able to migrate anything to Vue Router with the new syntax. So this specific section of the router is the matcher. And I want to talk a little bit about how it works to explain to you more about this order mechanism. So in the matcher, what we do is we transform strings like /home into a regular expression that has the leading slash and then home and verifies that it's the end, and it's a case insensitive regular expression. Now, when you have a parameter, like the second one, you can see that there is between the parentheses, there is a capturing group. So we're trying to catch anything but slashes. And then you also have another URL with the ID being only numbers. So that's the \d+, and you can see that you find that same regular expression inside of the group, the matching group on the right. Now, when you add them to the matcher, to the router, they are added in order. So if we add a new route /moviesnews, it's going to generate this URL with just a static string. But the problem is, if we later go to that page, the matcher is going to test them in order. So it's going to start with the home, it's not going to match, it's going to go on to the next one. The next one is just anything but a slash multiple times. So new does work on that aspect. So at the end, we did want it to match the movies new, which also matches, but we never reach it because the routes are in order. Now this is very confusing because the only indication of route ordering matter is the array. And it's not always intuitive to know, and if you're using something like Next, they have to implement the ordering on the side. So how do we fix this? We fix this by adding a score to each route. So based on the score, we can later on sort them and we can match them in the right order. So in this example, we're going to see that home, because it's one static segment, we have 70 points. Movies/news, we have two segments. We have movies and then news, and both are static, so we have 140 points. Movies ID, we have a dynamic parameter, so we have 60 points. And movies ID with a custom regex, we have a bonus of 5 points. So that's the final 135 points. And this is a bit more complicated behind the scenes on the router side, but this is overall what we do to handle the dynamic routing. Now, in Vue Router 3, we have some dynamic routing that you can use, but we only have one function. It's called add routes, and it takes an array of routes and it adds them on the same order. That doesn't really work for dynamic routing. It's more about adding routes during the runtime, but you still suffer from the problem of ordering matter. So you can do, for example, adding a movies ID, then a movies new, but you're never going to match the movies new because the movies/:ID is always going to match the URL movies/new before we get to match that one. So the dynamic routing in V4 looks like this. We have one function add route that allows you to add one route, and then you can call it multiple times to add multiple routes. It returns you a function that you can call to remove the route that you added, but you can also call remove route directly with the name of the route. You can check if the router has a route with the same name registered, because by default, when you add a route with the same name, it removes the previous route before adding the new one. And you can get the list of all the current routes with get routes, which is not something that existed before in Vue Router 3. If you want to know more about it, there is an RFC that you can check on the RFC repository. And we are likely going to backport some of these, but they're still going to preserve the same caveats for Vue Router 3. Now, when it comes to the URL, we're going to see a few changes, improvements on Vue Router. So it does transform a URL that looks like this into an object where we have the path section, where we have everything after the domain, which is the full path. We have an object of the parameters that are extracted when there are any. And then we have the query, the hash, the name, and a few other things. So inside of the URL, you have to know that only things after the domain matter, because in a front end, you don't have access to the domain. You cannot change it. If you change it, you're basically triggering a navigation. So you have the path, the query, and the hash. And all these properties can be accessed through the location object and different properties like path, search, and hash. But the point that I want to talk about here is, why do we have that %20? Where did this come from? So you might be aware of that space being transformed into %20, because when you write in most browsers a space in the query, it will be automatically transformed into its encoded version, the %20. So the URL encoding is not that complicated at first sight, but it's a bit more complicated to handle when it comes to edge cases. And the idea of having a router is not to worry about these, right? So we want to handle these for you. And as you can see, this is a very simple example. The double quote is encoded at %22, which is its hexadecimal representation. Same for the lower than character, 3C. But when it comes to anything that is beyond ASCII, like the N character in Spanish, you're going to see that you don't have a %F1, but instead you have something duplicated. Now, I won't go into the details of how to encode, how to create the encoded version, because we have functions for that. We don't need to know the rules. But it's interesting to know that you have different rules for every single section of the URL. So if you want to put it in a nutshell, if you want to write this HTML tag in the URL, you have to actually write this in the URL, which is a lot of nonsense. What are the rules actually? Well, anything that is non-printable character. So from 0 to 1F and also the delete character, the 7F, those have to be encoded. Anything that is non-ASCII, so anything after the tilde, has to be encoded. And then we also have to encode the percentage character because we need it to display encoded characters. But that's not enough. We also have a few rules specific to path, query, and hash section. So that's when it comes a bit funny. The hash is the simplest one. You have to encode the space, that's the small symbol. Then you have the double quote, the lower, bigger than, and the backtick. The path has to encode all these characters, but also needs to encode the hash, the interrogation mark, and the curly braces, because otherwise the URL wouldn't be able to differentiate from the query, the path, and the hash. And the curly braces are some specific syntax for URLs that can be used. The query, it's like hash, but you remove the backtick and you encode the hash, the ampersand, and the equal. So these are all the rules you need to know about URL encoding, and you don't actually need to know them, but it's nice to have some place where you can see them. The router will handle these for you. So what do you need to remember? You need to remember that whenever you're pushing a location, if you provide a string version of a URL, so if you call push with a string or with an object with a path property, the router cannot handle the encoding for you. It's up to you to handle the encoding. So these two versions are not correct. You should either use one of the two you see below. So you either push the encoded value by calling encode URL yourself or because you know the encoded version, or even better, you can also call a router push with a name. And this is especially good for parameters because you can provide them unencoded, and they will be encoded on the URL, and they will be also unencoded in your route object. So you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about the parameters, about encoding at all. You always manipulate the raw values, and they will work all the time. And this also works for the query and the hash on Vue Router 4. So you don't need to think about encoding the values that will be encoded for you. Okay, so there is one more way of navigating to places, and that's router link. So you can call router push to go somewhere, but you can also use a router link that when the user clicks on, they move somewhere else. So you, for example, have two links, one that goes to the Witch movie and the other one is going to a homepage. And depending on the current location, these router links are going to render an anchor tag with some classes. So for example, if we're on the Witch movie section, page, the homepage link is going to have this router link active class. Whereas if, for example, we go to a different place and we have by clicking a link like /users24post, we're going to still have the homepage active, but this link that we just added is going to have two classes, router link active and router link exact active. Now, what is exactly all these active links mechanism? So to make it clearer, we're going to talk about this table. So there is, on the left, you have the true prop that is passed to router link, and then on the right, we have the presence of different classes. Imagine we are on this URL, users/24post, and we have these 5 links. Now, both the named and the string representation of the homepage are going to be marked as active if we are in this URL. User/24 also, because it's the beginning of the URL. And then you have a one URL with a profile with it's not active, and one with a post, which is not only active, but it's also exactly active because it exactly matches the URL. Now, this is problematic because users/24 is related in a way to post probably. It's probably the parent route, but the homepage isn't. The homepage is an unrelated route. And we still have exact prop that we can use in Vue Router 3, but then the users/24 becomes inactive even though it was the parent if we use it everywhere. So it's like a patch in some places, and it's not the best way to patch it. So in the new version, and there is another problem, by the way, is that if you have a hash or a query in the URL, then if you have exact on the router link, then the link is not going to be active. So for example, we are on /users24 post related. but users24/post is not going to be active anymore because we're also comparing the hash. So the new behavior is a bit different. It takes into account only the path. And to be more specific, it only takes into account the route records. So it's still going to mark /users24 as active if users24/post is a nested route of users24. And on the other hand, the homepage is never going to be active if we're not exactly on that route. And the exact prop disappears. We don't need it anymore. And if you want to know more about this behavior, go check the RFC 136, which is about the router active link. Now, going back to how the links are represented, there might be something you have seen in your application, is that if you call router push, you might see some errors on your code base. And these are navigation failures, and you might have come across this case where you see this red error on the console where it says encoding promise, error, avoided redundant navigation, or redirection, blah, blah, blah. And this was a small problem in Vue Router 3 because we always had some API to handle the navigation failing or succeeding. And at some point we introduced promises. And the problem here is not really the encoding promise, or it is in a way, but the main problem is that we have error. So it looks like something is not okay in your code when it is. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. Where does it come from? At first, we only had the callback version on the router push. So we had incomplete and an abort, and it returned nothing. And then later on, we added a promise-based version that will resolve the promise as if we call incomplete and reject the promise as if we call on abort. And the thing is, people were not using that much the callback-based version because, we came across all these errors that people were not having before. So the thing is, the difference is that when you pass the callbacks, when you use a callback version, they are only called if you actually pass a callback. If you don't pass anything, they are never called. So incomplete was the equivalent of the global navigation guard or hook after each. And on abort, which is what is called if you do an X false, for example, in navigation guard, there is no global equivalent. There is no way to hook into that. So basically, if you were trying to have a global hook after each navigation, no matter if it worked or not, there were no way to do so. So what are we doing now is that we're merging both of incomplete and abort into a promise-based API. So on the v4 of Vue Router, there is no callbacks. You have a promise returned by router push and router.replace. And that promise resolves a failure, if there is any, when the navigation doesn't work. Meaning that you still get to check if we went to the place that we were, but we are not rejecting the promise anymore because it's not an error per se. It's just the navigation didn't finish, but that can be expected code. If there is, of course, an error in you throw an error somewhere in your code, that's gonna reject the promise. So the good thing is that now the router after each triggers after every single navigation. So for example, you won't have cases like the progress bar on the top hanging like that. And if you want to catch an error, you still have the onError function as well. So whenever something goes wrong and wasn't expected, you can catch it there. Now, what if you want to check these navigation failures? Well, if there is no failure, you can just check if failure is there, if it's a truthy value, or you can use isNavigationFailure as well. But if you want to check some specific cases for different kind of navigation failures, you can use the navigation failure type, which exposes 3 different types of navigation failures. The first one is cancel, whenever you call next false or return false. We're going to talk about that in a moment inside a navigation guard. We have aborted, which is when a new navigation happens when you were waiting for another one to resolve. So imagine you are going to a page where it needs to fetch some information, but the user clicks somewhere and they go to that place first. The old navigation is aborted. And then duplicated, which is when you try to go to the same location that you were at already, and the router is going to drop the navigation because we don't want to redundantly navigate to somewhere. And if you want to know more about this one, it was in an RFC some time ago, so more details there. Now there is a big improvement here when it comes to scroll behavior, not only from the API point of view, but also from a mechanism. And it's in part related to the navigation failures that we were talking before. We're gonna see that in a moment. But we are moving on from these object-based with selector and offset with a nested object. So we are moving from this version to a flattened version, where we replace the selector property with the EL element, and we no longer have offset XY, we have top and left. Now the reason we go this direction is to align with the scroll to options interface that exists and that is native. So we have the top, the offset, but we can also pass a new behavior that was recently added to Vue Router 3, by the way, where you can provide strings to say auto, smooth, and this is the equivalent of the CSS version scroll behavior smooth, and it's going to trigger scroll behavior animations if the browser supports them. So to give you an example here, we're going to multiple places. So I'm going to an anchor page and it's going to scroll to the anchor. I'm going to go back and go forward to see. I'm going to scroll a little bit, go forward, see that we go to the same place. And then when I go back, I see that I preserve where I was before. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going to scroll a little bit and use the history to go back and forth. And I'm going to see that I keep going to the same place. And I can see that also for the number one. So I'm going to click on the same anchor multiple times and I'm going to always go to that place. And now I'm probably going to activate the use smooth scroll. There we go. And you can see that the browser is going to animate the scroll by itself without having to do anything on our side except for passing that behavior, scroll behavior option. So if you want to know more about these, there is also an RFC that you can check on the repository. Okay, moving on into navigation guards. Now, navigation guards have a small problem, is that we have this callback next that we always have to call. And we have to call it exactly one time in each navigation guard. So this allows us to have asynchronous navigation guards and it was okay when we didn't have the promise API when the router was built, but now that we have promises, we can move into something a bit different. And the problem that I'm talking about is this one that I've seen very often. So we have next call twice, and this is going to create some problems. We cannot call it twice. So if we have something that we can only call once, why not directly use a return? So instead, in Vue Router 4, what we do is we return the value that we would have passed to next. This allows us to omit any parameter that is no longer used, like the from, and the function. And if we don't return anything, the navigation guard is going to resolve automatically. So you won't have navigation guards hanging around and navigation never finishing. And you will never be able to call, you will never be able to return two values twice because you can only return once. So this is also nice with async await because you can return a promise and it will work seamlessly as long as you don't include the next parameter in the function. And you want to know about the whole thing and people who participated in this, thanks to them, by the way, go check the RFC on the repository again. Now, another change that has been awaited for a long time is the route prop. So I could refer to it as route prop, but nobody's going to understand exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm going to refer to it to displaying models because that's the main use case that we want. Now, what is the actual use case though? The actual use case is you want to display something on the router view level that is different from the actual URL that you're at. So you have created all these routes saying if you're at the /about, you display the about page. If you have the user's colon ID, you have this other page. And you want to skip that. You want to work around that somehow. So that's what a modal is basically. You're displaying a modal, but you have a different URL. So if you directly go to the URL, you're going to end up in a different page. But because you clicked on some button, you're going to display a modal. Now, this is something not everybody is a fan of course, but we still want to provide this flexibility at the router level. So how does it work? So we have this small snippet to display modals. I'm going to talk about it very quickly. So the first line that we have here is useRoute. useRoute is pretty much the equivalent of this $route. So we need to get the current location we are at. Then we have the history state as a computer property. So this is a reactive version of the history.state. And we're using route.fullPath inside of the computer property to trigger a change on the computer property and to be able to retrieve the new state every single time. And then what we have is this route with model computer property. So we're going to check that history state that we just built, and it's going to check a property called background view. And if there is one, we're going to call the resolve function of the router to get a normalized route location that we can pass to the router view, so we can display something else that is not connected to the actual URL. If there is no such value in the history state, we just return the current route, so we display and we have the default behavior. And with these, then we can pass that to the router view, and we can have something like this. So this is a page where I can go to different user profiles. I can go back and forward, and I end up on the page user/something. But then I can display a model, and you can see that the URL changes there. And then if I go back in history and forward, I still get the same behavior. I still get the same URL. I can even reload the page, and the model is still there. I went a bit fast over there at the end, but you get the point. So you want to check more about these. There is also an RFC, like most of the changes right now on Vue Router. And the last thing is going to be the composition API. Now, of course, one of the most anticipated features of Vue 3 is the composition API. So we want to provide something that you can use in the Vue Router level as well. So we have use router, use route, before route update, before a leave, and use link. We might have more in the future, but so far these are the functions that we have. Now, use router and use route are pretty much the equivalent of $route and $router, but because we don't have access to these inside setup, we need to use different functions to retrieve these properties. And they are reactive, they work out of the box, like you would use $route. There is no .value you have to write, so you directly go route.params. Then we also have the navigation guards. So we have onBeforeRoute leave and onBeforeRoute update. Now these are the equivalent of the in-component navigation guards that you might have used before a leave, and before route update. And you might be wondering, why don't we have the before route enter? Now the thing is, before route enter triggers before we even mount the component. So in this case, it will be movie details. But setup executes when we are trying to mount the component. So it means that we would have to finish the navigation to mount the component, and then the onBeforeRoute enter will be called, which is too late because we already finished the navigation. However, on the case on onBeforeRoute enter and onBeforeRoute update, the components are already there mounted, so we can use them. And finally, the use link. It's pretty much the vSlot API that you have on RouterLink. So you get access to navigate, to go somewhere, href, which is the string representation of a route with the base that you provide to the router. And you have isActive and isExactActive as well. So you can pass a location to useLink the same way you would call push, resolve, or the toProp on a component, on a RouterLink component. We also have a lot of improvements on the DevTools. So the new version of the DevTools expose a new API for library authors, which is really, really nice. And we have these new panes that you can add yourself, so you can inspect the routes, you will be able to modify them on the fly. You can see on the events tab when you have a navigation, when it fails, when it works, etc., etc. So really looking forward to deploying this version soon. So to summarize, we have dynamic routing, custom history, better encoding defaults. These are the main new things on Vue Router Next. But we also have the composition API. We have better navigation guards, a much better TypeScript support because the whole code base is written in TypeScript. And then we have, easier to contribute code base, and there is better debugging for the DevTools. And we are also providing more and more per case documentation. And all of these features are coming at a lighter price. So Vue Router is about 9 kilobytes gzipped, but the next version of Vue Router is under 6.5 kilobytes. And even if you use the global version, so the one that includes all the dependencies, all the 3 shakeable features, you still get something that is about 8 kilobytes. So it's more than the previous Vue Router, while still providing more features. If you want to contribute to Vue Router Next, go check the repository. It's open, and I'm really excited to looking forward to your reports and ideas to improve the router in the future. And I want to finish by thanking my sponsors that are making it possible for me to work on open source. And I want you to know that if you sponsor me, you also get to put a logo on the Vue Router documentation page, which is pretty much similar to what you will have in the Vue documentation. I have empty spots right now, and it has almost 1 million impressions per month. So definitely worth checking out if you want to help me keep working on Vue Router full time. Thank you.